Welcome to Thinking Deepa by 6-7. Today we are diving into one of the most intense, fiery debates of our time, the clash between modern atheism and ancient religious texts. We're looking at a raw debate transcript, exploring whether the God of the Old Testament commanded genocide, how ancient texts handle the horrific reality of slavery, and how billions of people find moral guidance in words written during barbaric times. We'll explore two wildly different perspectives on the exact same text without taking any sides.
It really is a remarkable exchange to analyze. You have two highly articulate individuals just digging right into the most uncompromising, difficult posts of historical scripture. The intellectual friction is, well, it's palpable from the very first minute.
It totally is. And before we really get into the heavy details of how these two thinkers collide, I want to mention something quickly. If you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button. Let's lay out the mission for today's deep dive. We are unpacking a direct transcript from a live event hosted by the YouTube channel Pangburn.
Right, a very high-profile stage for this kind of thing.
Exactly. And on one side of the stage, we have Alex O'Connor. He's a prominent atheist voice, bringing a rigorous, literal, and, highly critical reading of the Bible. And on the other side is Dasush, a religious apologist defending the text through a theological and historical lens.
Setting the ground rules for our discussion today is crucial here. The source material we are looking at touches on incredibly sensitive themes. We're talking about the realities of war, the brutal mechanics of slavery, and really the fundamental nature of morality itself.
Yeah, these are highly charged topics, heavily intertwined with politics and religion.
Exactly. So as we guide you through this, we want to make it absolutely clear that we are remaining completely impartial. We are not here to endorse either viewpoint, to take a side, or to validate one argument over the other. Our only goal is to impartially report on the content provided so you can understand exactly how these two opposing worldviews clash.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because Alex O'Connor does not start small. He goes straight for the most difficult passages in the Old Testament. Specifically, he focuses on a literal reading of the book of Joshua.
Yeah, he doesn't ease into it at all.
Not even a little. When Alex brings up the siege of Ai, which was a type of Canaanite city, he's not just talking about the vague concept of ancient warfare. He is pointing to the chilling logistics of what the ancient Israelites are described as doing during that conquest.
He is insisting on reading the text exactly as it is written. He's stripping away any of that metaphorical softening that often happens in modern religious settings.
Right. He describes the sequence of events with a very forensic focus. The Israelites chase the combatant men out into the fields and the wilderness.
The soldiers, essentially.
Yeah, the soldiers. They defeated them there in open combat. But then, and this is the part Alex centers his entire moral critique on, the victorious army actively turned around, marched back into the city, and deliberately killed everyone who was left behind.
The non-combatants.
Exactly. The women and the children. Alex argues that you cannot simply hand-wave this away as the standard, albeit brutal eye for an eye ethic of the ancient Near East.
And to solidify that argument, Alex brings in another biblical narrative to prove this wasn't just a harsh standard of ancient justice. It was a mandated total eradication. He points to the story of King Saul and the Amalekites.
Oh, right. That's a pivotal part of his argument.
It really is. In that narrative, King Saul is actually punished by God. He loses his divine favor, specifically because he failed to kill all the livestock and the remaining captured king after a battle.
So he was punished for showing restraint.
Yes. So for Alex, that detail proved the command wasn't about strategic defense or proportional justice. It was an explicit demand for total genocide, and failing to execute it completely was considered a sin.
So if Daesh is facing down a literal text that describes the deliberate slaughter of non-combatants, how does he rescue the morality of the text?
What's fascinating here is how Daesh counters that reading. He doesn't try to deny the brutality of those passages at all.
Really? He just accepts it.
Daesh actually concedes a significant portion of the premise. He agrees that the Old Testament reflects a primitive, barbaric eye for an eye ethic, but his primary defense is that this ethic wasn't the final word. He argues that this primitive morality was eventually repudiated, transformed, and transfigured later in the New Testament.
Oh, I see. He's introducing an evolutionary framework for morality.
Precisely. Daesh claims that it was actually Christianity that invented the just war tradition centuries later.
The idea that certain actions in war are just off limits.
Right. It's the philosophical and legal tradition that fundamentally established that the slaughter of women, children, and non-combatants is out of bounds. Daesh is arguing that Alex is using a moral framework built by the very religion he is attacking to criticize its foundational texts.
And Desch doesn't just leave it in antiquity either. He brings the argument right into the modern era to prove that secular, non-Christian warfare is still capable of immense atrocities.
Yes, he references the devastating bombings of World War II. Dresden, Hamburg, Hiroshima, Nagasaki.
The absolute worst parts of modern conflict.
Exactly. Desch's point is that the incineration of women and children has, tragically, been the normal course of human war, regardless of religion. And to drive this home, Desch shares a deeply affecting anecdote from a Netflix documentary he watched about World War II.
Oh, the story about the U.S. bomber pilot. It's a very heavy part of the transcript.
It really grounds the abstract debate in human psychology. Desch describes how the documentary interviews an old U.S. bomber pilot who just completely breaks down on camera.
Wow.
This pilot recalls being given a bombing mission and asking the military authorities who was actually inside the building they were targeting. The authorities bluntly told him there were 20,000 women and children inside.
That is horrifying.
And the pilot says, "What the hell you want me to kill 20,000 women and children? We're supposed to be the good guys."
But he couldn't refuse the order.
Because it was an official military command, he felt he couldn't repudiate it. He followed the order and dropped the bombs.
So Desch uses this to show what? That humans are just naturally violent.
He uses this story to argue that human nature is universally brutal. He suggests that Alex's modern disgust at the slaughter of AI only exists because Alex is sitting on top of a Christian mountain of morality. According to Desch, it was the Christian tradition that eventually taught the Western world to value those innocent lives and recoil at their destruction.
But Alex pushes back incredibly hard on that framing. He fires back that his moral compass wasn't calibrated by people who listened to a god telling them to slaughter innocent women in the first place.
It's a very sharp retort.
And regarding the idea that Christianity eventually evolved into the just war tradition, Alex delivers another sharp counter. He says that thousand-year evolution of the early Christian church came, as he puts it, a bit too late for the Amalekites.
It highlights a core philosophical friction here. Alex is evaluating the morality of a specific historical command frozen in time,
while Desch is evaluating the overarching centuries-long trajectory of moral evolution that the text supposedly set in motion. Which makes their next thematic pivot so compelling. Alex's refusal to accept that moral evolution applies to divine commands leads directly into his next attack on the text, the economy of human ownership. Because if God was willing to tolerate ancient warfare, how did the text handle slavery?
a huge topic in biblical criticism.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because Alex brings the literal text of the book of Exodus to the forefront. He argues the Bible doesn't just describe slavery as a historical backdrop, it explicitly condones it and provides highly detailed instructions on how to practice it.
He goes right to the specific laws.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Reading the transcript, Alex zeroes in on some incredibly disturbing loopholes in Exodus chapter 21. Can you break down what Alex is pointing out regarding how slaves were treated after 7 years?
It is a highly specific and visceral reading of the law. Alex points out that Exodus 21 states a male Israelite slave is to go free after 7 years of service.
Which, on the surface, sounds like a limitation on slavery, like a form of indentured servitude with an end date.
Exactly. However, Alex highlights the massive catch embedded in the law. If the master gives that male slave a wife during his period of servitude, and they have children together, the wife and the children remain the permanent property of the master when the 7 years are up.
They don't go free with him.
No, they do not go free with him.
So the man is effectively forced to choose between his own freedom and his family.
That is exactly the trap Alex is highlighting. If the man decides he loves his family and cannot leave them behind, he must declare that to his master.
And then what happens?
At that point, the biblical text instructs that the man is to be taken outside. His ear is pierced with an awl against a doorpost like branded cattle, and he becomes a slave for life.
That is incredibly dark.
Furthermore, Alex points out that the rules are even harsher for female slaves, who aren't afforded the 7-year release option at all. Alex is challenging the apologist to explain why a supposedly perfect moral author couldn't have just instituted a simple moral improvement like mandating that the wife and children go free with the man.
It paints a horrifying picture of psychological coercion. So dealing with the text that outlines the permanent ownership of a family, how does Desch contextualize this?
Desch leans heavily back into his historical evolutionary framework. His core argument is that divine revelation didn't just magically appear in a sterile vacuum. It entered an already deeply primitive, barbaric world.
So the culture was already doing this.
Right. According to Desch, The Bible didn't arrive and immediately denounced the global institution of slavery because it had to immerse itself into the existing culture in order to change it from the inside out. He argues that the primary urgent goal of the Old Testament at that time was the displacement of polytheism with monotheism.
Getting people to believe in one God.
Exactly. The goal wasn't the immediate overhaul of global economics.
So the argument is essentially that God had to meet humanity where they were, dealing with the reality of a brutal world as it existed, rather than instantly making it utopian.
Yes. And Desch points to the long-term historical fruits of this text to validate that theory. He argues that you cannot isolate these ancient verses without looking at what the text eventually inspired centuries later.
What does he point to?
Desch highlights that the very first global anti-slavery movements, which began gaining significant traction around 1710 and 1720 in America, were driven primarily by Quakers and evangelical Christians.
People reading the Bible.
His point is that these abolitionists were deeply motivated by the exact same Bible Alex is critiquing. They clearly weren't reading it the way Alex is reading it. They were finding a profound mandate for human liberation within those pages.
But Alex counters that historical aim by arguing the Bible actually hindered the abolitionist movement just as much, if not more.
Because of how it was used in the South.
Right. He points out that Southern apologists for slavery plausibly and effectively used those exact Old Testament verses like the rules in Exodus 21 to justify what they were doing on the plantation.
It was heavily weaponized.
Completely. Alex poses a very sharp hypothetical. He says, if you go back in a time machine to the antebellum South and tell a plantation owner that slavery is immoral, that plantation owner is simply going to open the Bible to justify their actions. Alex even brings the New Testament into it, mentioning the Apostle Paul's writings that slaves should be obedient to their masters, including the cruel ones.
The debate really centers on how the text functions as a tool. Alex sees it as a tool that was successfully used to maintain oppression.
And Alex points out a glaring contradiction in how the abolitionists use the text. He notes that the anti-slavery movement heavily favored the story of Exodus, the narrative of God freeing the enslaved Israelites from Egypt.
A powerful story of liberation.
But Alex argues they conveniently left out the very next chapter of the narrative. Once the Israelites were liberated from Egypt, they marched into the Promised Land and, according to the text, slaughtered and enslaved the people who were already living there.
The Canaanites.
Yeah. Alex's argument is that if you read the story literally from start to finish, God didn't have an anti-slavery essence. He just had a specific problem with the oppression of his chosen people, but was perfectly fine mandating the oppression of others.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, this is where Desch introduces the vital concept of the interpretive tradition.
The interpretive tradition, explain that.
Desch argues that the significance of a text isn't found just in its raw, isolated, literal words. The true significance of a religious text is determined by its reading and the specific use to which it is put by communities over centuries.
Okay, so Desch brings up Martin Luther King Jr. and the Civil Rights Movement here to illustrate that, right?
He does. Desch points out that millions of enslaved people and later civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. took immense life-saving consolation in the Exodus story. He quotes the famous spiritual, "Go down, Moses, way down to Egypt land. Tell old Pharaoh, let my people go."
Right, a massive cultural touchstone.
Desch is saying that to a strict literalist like Alex, this use of the text might seem contradictory because of what the Israelites did next in Canaan. But to the millions who found the strength to fight for freedom through that narrative, the theological truth of a liberating God was incredibly real, powerful, and culturally transformative.
Desch actually uses a really interesting analogy here involving ancient Greek literature to explain this concept of interpretation.
Oh, the Oedipus analogy.
Yeah.
It perfectly illustrates Desch's frustration with Alex's literalism.
How so?
Desch says, imagine a student of ancient Greek drama reading the story of Oedipus. For centuries, the established interpretive tradition is that the Sophoclean hero represents a noble quest for truth, no matter how dangerous or personally destructive that truth might be.
That's how it's traditionally understood.
Right, that is how the culture has understood the text. But then, much later, Sigmund Freud comes along. Freud reads the exact same text and concludes, no, this work is really about people having a secret, repressed lust for their mothers.
Wait, let me make sure I'm following Desch's logic here. Is he actually arguing that centuries of tradition somehow overwrite the literal words on the page? Because I can see why Alex wouldn't accept that premise.
Desch is arguing that tradition doesn't erase the words, but it dictates their meaning for the community. Think about how modern legal systems treat something like the U.S. Constitution.
Okay.
It's a centuries-old document. We don't read the text regarding cruel and unusual punishment exactly the same way a judge in 1790 would have read it. A massive legal and cultural interpretive tradition has grown around those words, fundamentally changing how they are applied today.
So Desch is saying Alex is doing to the Bible what Freud did to Oedipus.
Exactly. Desch is comparing Alex to Freud in the Greek analogy, calling him a new interpreter. He's saying Alex is dropping into a text that Christians have read through the lens of Jesus for centuries, pointing at literal ancient battle commands, and completely ignoring the massive lived tradition that defines the religion today.
Telling him he's missing the forest for the trees.
Desch is essentially telling him, you can read it that way, but no actual Christian reads it the way you do.
But Alex refuses to let an interpretive tradition mask the text. He jumps right back in to deliver a strict textual rebuttal. He tells Desch point blank, sometimes a genocide is just a genocide.
Wow.
He is unwilling to let theological framing soften what he sees as undeniable, ordained atrocities written in black and white.
It reveals a profound disagreement on what a holy text actually is. Is it an inerrant historical record locked in the moral framework of the time it was written?
Or is it a living, breathing document defined entirely by how it is understood and applied by its followers thousands of years later?
Right.
And this incredible tension leads directly to the climax of the debate. I want to set the scene for you here because you have to remember the context of this transcript. This was a live event. The Pangburn YouTube channel peaked at 2,000 live viewers watching this happen in real time.
The atmosphere in the room must have been electric.
It totally was. They even announced at the end that there are poster printouts of the debaters waiting in the lobby for the audience to get signed. It has the energy of a heavyweight title fight.
High stakes.
Very high stakes. And right at the peak of this intense back and forth about interpretation versus literalism, Alex decides to stop the philosophical maneuvering. He cuts through the theological framework and demands a direct yes or no answer.
It's the moment the entire debate has been building toward. The point where abstract theology has to meet literal history.
Alex looks directly at Desch and asks, did the God that you believe in morally justifiably command the slaughter of innocent children and women in the Old Testament?
You can imagine the absolute silence in that auditorium, waiting for the apologist to navigate that trap.
And Desch gives a blunt, unflinching, one-word response, yes.
This raises an important question. Really the defining question of our deep dive today. Let's really look at the weight of that single word, yes.
It's heavy.
It perfectly crystallizes the immense tension of modern religious apologetics. You have an apologist who has spent the entire debate eloquently explaining historical context, the slow evolution of human morality, and the beauty of the interpretive tradition that inspired abolitionists and civil rights leaders.
He built a very sophisticated defense.
He has built a sophisticated, modern defense of his faith. Yet, when forced into a corner, having to reconcile his belief in a morally perfect, unchanging God with the literal text of his foundational holy book, he feels he has no choice.
He has to admit it.
He has to publicly admit that, yes, the slaughter of innocents was morally justifiable in that specific ancient context.
It's a jaw-dropping admission. The transcript notes that Alex immediately turns to the audience and essentially says, well, we've covered the historical context, we've debated the metaphorical meaning, but now we've hit the moral truth of the text. And it's up to you all to decide what to do with it.
It is a moment that forces you to grapple with the collision of two completely different, perhaps irreconcilable worldviews.
Absolutely.
What happens when a modern defender of the faith feels intellectually cornered into justifying ancient atrocities rather than simply denouncing them? It exposes the struggle to reconcile our modern moral intuitions that instinctively recoil at the thought of genocide and slavery, with the foundational religious texts that shaped the very civilization we live in.
So what does this all mean for you, listening right now? We've explored two drastically different ways to approach the foundational texts of Western history. On one hand, you have Alex O'Connor's rigorous, literal reading. He points to undeniable textual atrocities, explicit laws governing the permanent ownership of human beings, and detailed accounts of commanded genocide.
He brings the receipts, so to speak.
He does. He argues that you cannot simply interpret away the historical victims of these texts, and that treating the words as anything less than literal allows them to be weaponized by people in power.
And on the other hand, you have Desch's interpretive theological framework. He argues that ancient texts must be viewed as seeds planted in a barbaric world.
A slow growth over time.
Yes. While the literal words reflect the brutality of their time, the overarching narrative planted the seeds that eventually grew into the just war tradition, the abolitionist movement, and the very moral framework that allows us to look back at the past and call it barbaric in the first place.
It leaves us with a lot to chew on. So I want to leave you with this final thought. Think about the foundational texts or philosophies in your own life. When our modern moral compass conflicts with the literal words of the past, do we discard the text entirely because of its flaws, or do we rely on centuries of human interpretation to find the good within it? It's a tension humanity has wrestled with for thousands of years, and as this debate shows, we are nowhere near finished.